The desert didn't cry when it hurt. It cracked, split open in silence beneath the weight of sky and sun, until even the bones buried beneath it forgot the sound of water. Elias Boone understood that, had lived it for years, long enough that the wind no longer whistled through him. It just passed on by, same as the people in town did. A nod here, a squint there. No one asked about his silence. No one offered company, and that suited him just fine. The heat was easing when he first saw her. He'd been stringing new wire along the northern fence, boots dust-caked, sweat salt-stiff on his shirt, when a flicker of movement caught his eye near the creek. Not the movement of a lizard or a hawk's shadow. Slower, heavier, human. He dropped the wire and moved toward it, hand brushing the butt of the rifle slung across his back more out of habit than fear. What danger could possibly crawl through this forgotten corner of the world? The shape was barely more than a smear against the sand, dark hair matted with blood, skin cracked and blistered, wrapped in torn leather and sun-faded cloth. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a corpse. Then she shifted. A low, ragged breath. A hand, trembling, curled around a knife with a broken hilt. The blade didn't lift, just rested there like a whisper that had lost its will to speak. Elias crouched slowly, shadows stretching long around them both. Her eyes open, dark, bottomless things, sharp despite the fever in them. She didn't plead, didn't flinch, just watched him like she was already halfway to whatever came next. "You alone?" he asked. Her cracked lips parted, but no sound came. She blinked once, slow. He could have left her there, could have stood up, walked back to his wire in his silence. No one would have known. No one would have blamed him. Apache girl out here on ranch land? Folks would call it justice. Maybe. Old blood debts, unpaid ghosts. But something inside him wouldn't move. Maybe it was her stillness. Maybe it was the way she didn't beg. Not because she was proud, but because something had stripped her even of that. He sighed. The kind of sound that didn't belong to words. Then he reached for her. She didn't resist as he gathered her up, though her fingers never quite let go of the knife. Her skin burned against his arms, fever-hot, her body light as a coiled rag. He felt the ridges of her ribs beneath his calloused hands. A trail of blood soaked to the front of his shirt as he carried her across the fence line, and into a world that had never once been kind to either of them. By the time he got to the house, the sun had folded behind the hills. The light bled gold through the slats of the old barn, casting long veins of shadow along the floorboards as he kicked the door open and laid her down on his cot. The room smelled of dust, oil, and worn leather. It hadn't seen another soul in years. He lit a lantern, peeled off his gloves, and went to work. Water boiled on the iron stove while he peeled away what remained of her tunic. Bullet graze on the shoulder, deep gash across her side. Infection had already set in. He cleaned it with a rag dipped in whiskey, his hand steady but his breath hitching when she flinched. "You're lucky," he muttered. "Could have hit something deeper." She made no reply, but her eyes were still open, still fixed on him, still watching. Later, when her wounds were wrapped in linen strips and her fever had softened to a shimmer instead of a blaze, Elias sat across the room and stared at her in the lamplight. She slept fitfully, mumbling in a language he half recognized but didn't understand. Something old, something sacred. He didn't sleep. Instead, he let the past creep in like smoke through the cracks. Faces he'd buried, cries he'd tried to forget. The sight of his boys she was abandoned in the barn after the fire. The way his wife had whispered goodbye without saying the word. And always the same refrain from the townfolk. Boone's turned wild out there. Talks to horses, not people. They weren't wrong. But something about the girl, the stranger carved out of grit and pain, felt like a question he hadn't asked in a long time. A question without blame, without sides. Come morning, he brewed coffee, careful not to wake her. Outside, a pale wind stirred the dust. The air smelled of heat and rust and faint mesquite. He opened the barn doors and let the light spill in, hoping the day would feel less like a wound. When he returned, she was awake, sitting up, pale as bone but upright. Her eyes tracked him with the same quiet edge, but there was a difference now, something cautious, curious. "You got a name?" he asked, offering her the tin cup. Her lips touched it, drank. Then, hoarse and low, she said, "Naeli?" He nodded. "Elias." She gave no sign of recognition. Just leaned back, her breath ragged. Silence grew between them like a tree no one planted. Not cold, not unwelcome. Just there, later that afternoon, he found her trying to stand. Stubborn, shaking. She fell against the wall, and when he caught her, she didn't push him away. "Why, help me," she asked then, voice like sand and storm. He didn't answer right away. Just helped her to the cot again, tucking the blanket around her like it mattered. "You look like someone no one was coming for," he said. "And I know how that feels." She didn't speak again after that. The sky that night bled orange and violet over the ridgeline, painting the world in color too beautiful to last. Elias stood at the door, watching it fade, the shape of Naeli quiet behind him, her breathing steady now, softer, and just as he turned to head back inside, he saw something in the distance, a rider, still in black on the hill crest, watching, waiting.
The days that followed blurred into each other like smoke on the wind. Elias rode slow, trailing the mountains to the west and letting the land guide him where maps could not. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The people of Dry Creek watched him pass with wary eyes, their whispers coiling like dust devils behind him. Some nodded in respect. Others looked away. After what happened with the Daltons, trust didn't come easy. Not for anyone. But Elias wasn't chasing people anymore. He wasn't chasing justice either. What he sought couldn't be named. It moved with the rhythm of hooves and the silence of instinct. It existed somewhere beyond rules, beyond reputation. Somewhere in the half-lit space between what you lose and what you still believe in. Each morning he found signs. Scuffed earth, tufts of silver hair caught in barbed wire, hoofprints pressed deep into creek beds. Once, he spotted them from a distance, cresting a ridge at twilight, silhouettes framed by the sinking sun. They didn't run. They simply watched, then turned, vanishing like ghosts into the hills. Elias never pushed, never called out. He let them come when they were ready. Naeli was quiet, but not hollow. Her voice came in small doses, less like conversation, more like ritual. She would hum to herself while boiling water, murmur Apache prayers while tying bundles of sage in the herb rack, speak only when words were necessary. But each time she did, Elias felt something shift, subtle as wind through pine needles. He caught her one standing barefoot in the garden just before dawn, her eyes closed, face turned toward the east, as if asking the sun to remember her, or maybe to forget. "You always stand still like that?" he asked from the porch. She didn't look at him. "Only when I'm listening." "To what?" She opened her eyes. "To who I was, before they came." They didn't speak about the rider Elias had seen that first night. Not yet. But the shadow of it hung between them like an unsaid name. She knew. He saw in the way she flinched when a hawk's cry cracked the silence, in the way her hands curled tighter around the coffee cup, when thunder rolled low behind the distant hills. The town had begun to take notice. Supplies stopped arriving at Boone Ranch. A wagon meant to deliver feed turned around before the gate. The blacksmith's boy, who once sold Elias nails and horseshoes with grin, avoided his eyes entirely now. Something rotten had spread through Dry Creek, and it smelled like fear. Elias didn't press Naeli about what she was running from, but he began sleeping with his rifle beside the bed again. He tried to explain at once, this sudden coldness from the town. "They think you're a threat," he said. Naeli didn't blink. "Because I am." He almost smiled, but the truth of it settled like ash on his tongue. One evening, the sheriff rode out, kicking up dust on the path and dismounting with his hat in his hand. He wasn't a cruel man, just a tired one. Lines around his mouth told the story of a lawman who'd buried too many friends. "You know why I'm here," he said, voice low. Elias nodded, leaning against the post. "They talking about forming up?" "Not yet, but the Black riders." The sheriff's voice faltered. "Word is they're riding east. You know what they're looking for." Elias didn't answer. "Boone," the sheriff said, stepping closer. "You've already lost more than most. Don't let your pride write her death warrant." "I ain't protecting her out of pride." "Then what?" Elias looked past him, toward the barn where Niley now sat stringing wire, her hands deft and fast. Because no one else will. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded once and mounted up. Dust swallowed him a moment later. Later that night, Elias found Niley in the barn. She was repairing a saddle strap with needle and rawhide, her fingers moving with quiet precision. "You know they're coming," he said. She didn't look up. "They always come." He sat across from her, watching her hands. "You afraid?" "No." "Why not?" She paused and met his gaze. "Because you are." He let the silence fall between them like a dropped stone. She didn't say it to mock him. She said it like it was fact, like it meant something he hadn't figured out yet. The next morning brought a shift. Niley saddled his mare before he even stepped outside, and when he emerged, she handed him the reins without a word. "You going somewhere?" he asked. "No," she said. "You are." He frowned. "You're going to the trading post. You need supplies, tools, coffee." Her voice softened. "I can finish mending the barn." He wanted to protest, but something about the set of her jaw told him she wasn't asking. She was offering him trust, that she'd be here when he returned. He rode into Dry Creek under a sky the color of tarnished steel. Folks didn't greet him. A few turned their backs. One woman spat in the dirt as he passed. Inside the trading post, the clerk barely made eye contact. Elias loaded what he could into his saddlebags and turned to leave, then froze. Pinned to the post beside the door was a scrap of paper. On it, a crude drawing of Niley's face. Below it, 4 words scrawled in charcoal: "Stolen property. Reward offered." His breath went cold. He stepped outside, the wind sharp against his cheeks, and mounted up without a word. He rode hard back to the ranch, dirt flying behind him like rising smoke. When he reached the gate, his horse skidded to a halt. Something was wrong. The barn door stood open, swaying. The chickens were loose, squawking madly. A trail of boot prints led from the well to the porch. And there, sitting still as stone, was a crow feather nailed into the beam beside the door. And just beneath it, driven into the wood with surgical precision, was a bullet casing. Elias reached up and pulled it free, blood hammering in his ears. He turned toward the hills, jaw clenched. Behind him, Niley stepped out of the barn, holding his rifle in her arms like she'd been waiting. Not for him, but for them. The morning arrived with a silence too heavy to be natural. Not even the roosters dared to cry. A wind pressed through the valley, low and mean, dragging the scent of ash across the fields. Elias stood on the porch, a mug cooling in his hands, watching the horizon turn gold like an old bruise. Beneath his coat, his chest felt tight, not from fear, but from the knowledge that there was no turning back now. Niley stood barefoot beside the barn, her long hair braided and tied with a strip of red cloth. The rifle rested in her arms, steady as her gaze. She hadn't asked for permission. She hadn't said much at all since the feather and bullet showed up. But something in her posture said she'd made her peace with the world, with herself, and maybe with him. "They'll come from the east," she said, her voice low and certain. "I figured," Elias replied, not looking at her. "You sure you want to be standing when they do?" "I'm sure I won't be kneeling." He nodded once. That was all there was to say. By midday, the sky was split by distant hoofbeats, thunder that didn't belong to any storm. The black Speriders came in a wide arc, 50 deep, black coats flapping like crows in formation. They didn't charge. They didn't need to. Men like that wore their violence slow, like oil over fire. Elias stepped forward, his rifle strapped across his shoulder, his hands empty for now. The one in front, broad, pale, with a scar like a lightning bolt down his cheek, reeled his horse to a stop. He looked at Elias like a butcher eyeing meat, not curious, just measuring. "You got something of mine," he said. "I don't reckon I do," Elias answered calmly. The man's smile was jagged. She was promised to be sold, to settle debts. "You think you're the first man to try saving one of their kind." "She ain't yours to promise," Elias said. "She's not anyone's." The leader glanced around the ranch, unimpressed. You aiming to die over this?" Elias tilted his head. "Ain't planning to die, but I've stood for worse." The first shot came before the air had a chance to breathe. Elias dropped low, drawing his rifle in a fluid motion. The crack of return fire sharp and righteous. Naeli moved like lightning. Already on the barn roof, her shots clean and deliberate. The ranch exploded into chaos. Dirt flying, horses screaming, gunfire echoing across the hills like drums in mourning. They fought not with fury, but with precision. Elias fired only when he could see a face. Naeli never wasted a round. Blood hit the dust, and the riders began to learn that not all quiet men were harmless. A bullet sliced Elias' shoulder, spinning him against a porch post. He bit down on a growl, reloaded, and kept firing. His world narrowed to motion and instinct. Every breath earned, every step calculated. He saw when the riders circled wide, gun drawn, aiming for Naeli's back. Elias dropped him with a single shot. Their eyes met across the yard, hers wide, not in fear, but in recognition, of trust, of something wordless and deep. Still, they were outnumbered. 10 more closed in, shouting, bullets screaming past like wasps. Elias braced to the end, planting his boots like roots in the earth. And then, hooves, not from the east, but from the west. Riders emerged from the tree line, Apache warriors, swift and silent, faces painted with coal and ochre, arrows glinting in the sun. They rode with vengeance braided into their hair and grief pressed into their bones. The black spur riders hesitated, and in that pause the land changed. Arrows flew, knives flashed, chaos turned to collapse. Elias lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Beside him, Naeli stepped forward, a war cry rising in her throat. Not rage, but remembrance. She moved like someone reclaiming something stolen. It was over in minutes. The surviving riders fled, trailing dust and blood. The wounded were left behind, groaning, weapons discarded. One of the Apache riders dismounted, nodded once at Naeli, and turned to Elias with something close to respect. "She's kin," he said in accented English. "You held the line." Elias didn't answer. He just lowered himself onto the porch steps, blood staining his shirt, and let the sun warm his skin. By sunset, the bodies were buried, and the ranch stood quiet again. The Apache riders had gone, leaving behind only hoofprints in a silence not heavy, but full. Naeli sat beside Elias on the step, her arm brushing his. She said nothing, just handed him a fresh cup of coffee. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. "You could have run," he said after a while. "So could you," she answered. He looked at her, then, really looked. Her face was no longer drawn by fear, her eyes no longer shadowed. She looked like someone who had finally come home to herself. "You staying?" he asked. "I haven't decided." He nodded, as if that was the only honest answer. The wind stirred the dust, warm and slow, carrying the scent of mesquite and gunpowder. Elias closed his eyes and let it move through him, hollowing out the places grief had once filled. He thought about his son, his wife, the long years of silence. And now, this strange, fierce woman beside him, whose name meant "I love you" in a language older than maps. He didn't reach for her hand. Didn't need to. The sky turned purple, stars beginning to peek through the edge of dusk. Somewhere nearby an owl called. Life went on, bleeding slowly back into bones of the land. But just before the light gave out entirely, a figure appeared on the trail. One last rider, alone, carrying something in one hand that caught the last glint of sun. A white flag, or a noose.